Hey folks, my name's Kevin and it's time for some more pen nerdery because once again, there's an incredibly cool new pen on the market with an incredibly cool and weird new mechanism. So yeah, we got to talk about it. Now, this is the Herman Knives Epika, and we'll talk all about who that is, why it's called that, and everything in just a moment. But first, I got to start off by saying a huge thank you to my friend Isaac for sending this my way. Actually, he had Polish Custom Knives sent this directly to me, so I got to see how it came with the original packaging and everything like that. We'll talk about that later because these COAs are incredibly cool, and what it ships with is just neat. But yes, this is number 109. And that number is significant to him, so what incredible luck he was able to snag this in one of the drops, but also what incredible luck that the number that he cares about is on this version that is just so freaking cool looking. Look at this. We're going to talk all about this milling in just a second, but I ended up liking this so much that I got my own. And not only did I get my own, but you're number 109, I'm number 110. We're neighbors. So I got to send a second huge thank you to my friend Dan, aka Pocket Priorities. He has such an incredible collection of knives too, by the way. Amazing stuff. But if you like pen content, he has the broadest and most interesting collection of pens I've ever seen. And he's constantly posting new content about that. Definitely go give Pocket Priorities a follow. And he was kind enough to do a group buy. I mentioned that these are shipped by Polish Custom Knives. That's the only place you can get anything from Herman, knives or otherwise. And unfortunately, they charge $40 shipping. That's their cheapest option. It's nice fast shipping, but it's their cheapest option. And so Dan was kind enough to put together a group buy several at once and save on shipping for people like me. And he was kind enough to let me pick my favorite of the serial numbers. And this is 0110. The symmetry there makes my brain so happy. So huge thank you to both Dan and Isaac for making this video possible. Now, for the most part, these two pens are identical. There is an interesting and unexpected difference between the two aside from the milling, but for the most part, it's just the milling. So throughout this entire video, we're going to be focusing on this one and only bring up the other one where we need to. So I said that this is from Herman Knives. If you don't know who Herman Knives is, that is the knife brand from Bartosz Herman. I'm sure I'm butchering that name, so we're just going to say Herman like everyone else does. And if he's known for three things, it's probably, first of all, let's just get this out of the way. Oh my God, his knives every single one of them has this incredible sound to them, but he's also known for incredibly striking lines and really stylized knives. He loves to do crazy anodization, fun colors, really vivid, bright, contrasting colors, interesting milling and engraving and like hand embellishing with like little dimpling patterns all over the place. His knives are wildly stylized. And he's carrying all of that over here to the pens as well. These versions, like I said, are both basically nude, and the difference between them is the engraving, but a lot of the offerings he's doing are in crazy weird colors and stuff like that. And a common thing across Herman for his knives, and something that he's trying to do here, is to make a lot of variants in them. Very rarely do two of his knives or two of these new pens, unless you're looking at the nude options, look like each other. They're all really different from each other. And so while these aren't custom in the sense of you getting to pick out things, they are very much in that custom sense where no two really are alike. Now, this pen is called the Epika, and that is the Polish word for epic, but in the like literary sense, like the epic poem sense, like the Iliad or the Odyssey. And that's supposed to reflect the journey it took in order for them to actually get this working. It's not uncommon for knife makers these days to try to get into making pens. Often what happens is they want a lathe for some reason, like maybe they want to make their pivot screws in-house, and then they need that lathe to be running 24/7 to making profits because lathes are expensive. And so they start trying to put out something that the lathe can do, often a really simple bolt action pen. And so it's really cool when knife makers are instead doing something innovative and novel. A good example of that would be the PQD that came out from Koenig Knives earlier. It's a completely weird, new, fun, clever way of doing a mechanism. I love stuff like that. But with Herman Knives, this was actually kind of the opposite. They got the lathe in part to make this, because this has been a dream of his to make for a really long time. Because this is something that Herman has been working on for literally a full decade. And partly that is they just didn't have the experience, equipment, and skills to make something like this when they first wanted to. Part of the reason why it took so long to get this right is because doing it the way that they wanted to do it is actually really challenging. This is one long continuous piece, and that is a very, very long hole to drill out inside a piece of bar stock. Getting that straight, concentric, and doing the kind of internal work that they're doing on this is extremely difficult to do. They had to find totally new types of drill bits that have like forced liquid cooling running through the bit itself. He posted a great video walking through some of the journey to get here. There's also stuff like this has one long continuous taper, and getting that to come out perfectly every single time is extremely difficult. There's a reason why a lot of pens are just perfectly straight lines. That's a lot easier to do. And then again, this has a completely novel mechanism. We'll talk all about how it works later, but for now, just recognize that it is very complicated and completely new. So there's no blueprint to follow. They had to trial and error everything about how this works. But at long last, these are on the market, and I could not love it more. It is so incredibly cool. And before we talk about how this mechanism works, I want to talk more just about the overall aesthetic, some really interesting details it has, and generally speaking, where I think that this fits and why in terms of usage, because this is so starkly different from something like this. There's a lot of pens like this on the market that kind of lean quite utilitarian. I see a lot of value in stuff like that. But this feels like a luxury good. It just looks classy in this old school kind of way. Something about this that almost feels like it's vintage, like it's from the 1950s or something. They just don't make pens that look like this these days. And part of that is this dramatic slope as you go. This is actually a pretty wide pen at the top, and that is what originally made me a little bit hesitant about trying one of these. I tend to like slimmer pens, but a friend of mine pointed out that it tapers so much that it's actually quite slim down here. Now that I actually have one and I can measure it, it's actually kind of the perfect size where you actually grip it. To give you a better idea of how much the diameter of this pen varies as we go down, I measured this in a couple of different places. I measured at the thickest spot, which is right here at the top of this grip section, the middle point of this grip section, and the bottom of this grip section. I personally hold it right around here, so all of my grip is in this bottom portion. At the top up here, this pen is 0.4365 inches wide, which means that it is even a little bit wider than something like a fell holder, or even bigger than a full-size tactile turn. But once you get down to the top of this grip portion, it has slimmed down to 0.4135, which is almost exactly the same as a billet spin cam pen. Once you get down to the middle of the grip section, we're at 0.387, which is almost exactly the same as a Big Idea design pen in their slim form factor. And once we get to the bottom of the grip, we're at 0.345, which is so slim that it's even slimmer than something like the Aerocrafted Retract Click, which is 0.35. This thing is 0.345 down here. And what that means is that where I actually grip this is ranging from 0.345 to 0.387. That's exactly my sweet spot. That is exactly what I want pens to be. Anywhere in that range feels good to me. And this is all of them at once. And so when I'm actually writing with this, it feels perfectly sized for my hand. Now the weight on this is actually kind of high. This is 0.1267 ounces, or actually this one here is 0.1267 ounces. Technically speaking, this engraving on here is removing material, and it does actually drop the weight. It goes from 1.267 to 1.238. So you're losing 0.03 of an ounce, or roughly 0.84 grams. They're basically interchangeable, but at the end of the day, this is 1.25 ounces, and that puts it at a reasonably heavy side. In fact, that's even a little bit heavier than this full-size tactile turn, and that is a much bigger pen. And so what this gives you is this sensation of a really kind of dense pen. It's not that 1.25 ounces is all that heavy. If you're into brass or bronze or even copper pens, those are going to be way, way heavier, but this is definitely not a featherweight pen. You feel that weight, but I think that comes across in that kind of quality heft way. Everything about this feels very sturdy and rigid, and that weight, I think, lends to that sensation of this being a luxury good again. The balance itself is right at the base of the clip, and from my hands, the way I hold that puts it right here in front of where it touches my hand, and so this actually feels quite well balanced to me. I've actually really enjoyed writing with this, and I don't mind that extra weight at all, in large part because of how this is balanced. But that extra weight and the fact that this is thicker like that, and that it's just so classy looking. This aesthetically and functionally leans to me more like a desk pen. It seems like the kind of pen you would have on your desk in your office, rather than something you would slide into your pocket or your bag, though you certainly can. This clip works actually really, really well. I was able to slide it out of my pocket without any problem, or I've been taking it in my field notes book to my film studies class. I just slide it in there and it works great for that too. And this smaller length here actually does make it quite carryable. I said this weighs more than this full-size tactile turn, but it's so much shorter. This is coming in at only 4.853 inches. And that's quite compact, especially for something that uses a full-size Parker refill. So let's talk about refills for a moment, because I actually got quite nervous when I saw that these ship with a Fisher Space Pen refill. I like the Fisher Space Pen refill a lot, and it's a really cool refill. The way that it will write in underwater and upside down, it's a really cool refill. But it's a proprietary sized refill, and there's nothing else in that form factor. And so I was nervous thinking that these might only fit a Fisher Space Pen. But luckily, this is instead targeting the full Parker size and using the little adapter cap that Fisher Space Pen refills come with in order to fit that instead. So you can put whatever refill of choice you want in here. Now let's take a quick aside, because there's an interesting thing. If you open this up, when we look inside here, the way you change out that refill is by just twisting this off, and it splits up here at the top. You do want to be careful as you're doing this. The pen cap floats above, so it's not making any contact, but you do want to make sure that you're not torquing it off to the side as you take this off, so that you don't accidentally rub this spot here along the pen. But if we look in here, what's actually shipping inside is a standard Fisher Space Pen refill. There's nothing unusual about this, but it is worth noting that it is blue, and it's uncommon for people to ship blue refills with their pen. But check this out. Inside the box here, it ships with a bonus little refill. I wonder how many people even noticed that this is not a standard Fisher Space Pen refill. It actually says manufactured by Fisher Space Pen Co. for Herman Knives. They managed to get custom printed Fisher Space Pen refills just for them. And that in itself is really interesting and cool to me, but it's quite peculiar that they got custom printed refills but ship the pens themselves with a normal version. I wonder why. My one guess is that when you get a custom order batch job like that, they probably don't come with these adapters and they needed the adapters, and that's my hunch. So luckily, like I said, you can swap in any Parker size refill you want in here and it'll work just fine. Now I'm going to take a moment to call out the fact that there is not a Higby thread here. A Higby thread is a cut-off ramped thread at the start of the threading that makes it easier to screw things together and avoid cross-threading. There isn't anything like that here. I was a little bit disappointed to see that, especially at this price point, and especially with how incredibly small detailed everything else is, but I haven't actually had any difficulty getting this to thread on. But I mentioned earlier that this floats above the pen refill right here, so especially since this isn't self-centering the way Higby threads do, you want to make very careful sure that you are aligning that correctly when you're putting this on, so you're not accidentally cocking that or scraping the clip along the pen. All you have to do is put this in, crank that down, and you're good to go. Now, talking about refills, there is a subtle amount of tip wiggle on one of these two. This one has just a slight bit. It's enough that you definitely notice it if you're sitting here and wiggling like this, but it's not enough that you notice it when actually writing with the pen. I tried this at every different angle and there was no perceivable tapping as I went down. And so this falls into the category of noticeable wiggle when you're testing for it, but not noticeable in actual use. And it's also worth noting that this one over here, yeah, I really kind of don't feel any wiggle on this one. So it's interesting that there's variance. Dan in his videos, he's gotten probably like 6 of these at this point. He noticed a little bit of variance there too. And the thing that I think it might come down to is the refills themselves. I think there might be subtle variance there, but I want to point something else out. The reason why there is a little bit of wiggle on something like this is because it is trying to fit a full Parker refill. And while the Fisher Space Pen generally fits a Parker refill spec, it's not actually a full ISO G2 standard pen refill. And so it's a little bit narrower at the tip. I swapped in a variety of different Parker refills in here, and some of them had a little bit of perceivable wiggle and some of them didn't. And that's the reason you would make it slightly oversized like this. Even though Parker size refills are supposed to follow a spec, that spec actually has some amount of wiggle room in it. That's the tolerance. And that means that if you get refills from different manufacturers, they will be ever so slightly different. And so this ever so slight bit of slack right here allows you to ensure that any refill you'd want to put in there that fits a Parker size will still fit and not jam up down here. So like I said, while I do feel a little bit of wiggle right here, it's not something I feel in actual use. And with my favorite Parker refills, I didn't actually feel any at all. Let's look at some more small details about this aesthetic, because this is an incredibly cool finish. I'm going to zoom in real quick and try and see if I can show this off to you. On the plain Jane versions like this, they have this really beautiful orange peel finish, but there's actually two different versions. It's hard to tell, but this right here is a softer, brighter, more reflective version of an orange peel than what's on the clip. This has deeper grooves in and is slightly more textural. But these are both smooth enough that you're not actually going to meaningfully feel that. You can tell if you're rubbing your finger against it, but mostly it's just a pleasant, soft, slight grip quality. And there's also some neat details about how this clip is done. You can see there's some interesting shapes going on in here, and there's a couple of places where they've left the milling lines. In most of the places, they've completely cleaned it up. But there are a few spots where they've, I think, intentionally left them in because they end up looking just kind of neat, being able to see the gradation there. In general, this is a really cool looking clip. It's distinct, it really stands out, it looks really neat looking down the barrel like that. That is such a cool view. We'll talk all about the shape of this and how I think that impacts the functionality of this when we get to talking how this mechanism works. But I also wanted to point out this. This is one of the only differences between these two pens. I thought that they were going to be identical except for the milling, but check this out. This ring around the top is actually different. The one on the left has sharp, crisp edges, and the one on the right actually has those peaks knocked off and a very small micro milling pattern put onto it. It's a really neat, subtle difference. Okay, now it's time to talk about these details. Oh, look how freaking cool this is. This pattern is here along the top and along the bottom down here. It's much, much deeper down here. This is laser engraved, and actually Herman posted a really cool video talking about laser engraving and how they do it. They're focusing on how they do it for these COA cards, and look at these things. They're absolutely stunning. They've got this beautiful laser anodized color pattern on them, and this really cool texture to everything. It's just so striking. And these are thick, sturdy, hefty pieces of titanium. And that's what the actual COA looks like inside. It is a beautiful work of art. I don't know if my camera is going to catch this, but this kind of watermarking pattern that's going on right here along the back, right there, that actually has a red and yellow color tint to it at just the right angle. How incredibly cool is that? And in the video, they're talking about the laser anodization and laser engraving for these, but that's how they're pulling off this texture here too. Now, I'm the type of nerd that has a trinocular microscope, and so I hooked my camera up to that. And yeah, what's really, really fascinating is what the texture inside this looks like. It is so three-dimensional. It's all of these kind of pits and craters. It looks like the surface of the moon or something. It is really, really neat. And that is a side effect of the deep engraving process they're doing with a laser. It doesn't work the same way as milling. And when you zoom back out to the macro level, it gives you this really cool contrast where the outside is this shiny silver and the inside is this dark charcoal gray. But in the right light, all those little high and low spots and different surfaces actually reflect the light in a really amazing, kind of mesmerizing way. In very bright, direct light that actually kind of sparkles inside there. It is so stunning looking. And the pattern itself is just really neat. It almost looks like a snowflake in a way. It's made up of these little zigzags, little Z's, M's, N's, W's kind of shapes. It's so cool. Like I said, they repeat this at the top, but it's done very, very differently. This is still laser engraved, but this isn't deep etching the same way. So you get these refined, clean, straight lines in the top part. It's still so incredibly striking, but it actually stands out in contrast to the grip on the bottom. They echo each other and feel very on theme with each other, but they're different enough that it doesn't feel like it's monotonous. I think this is one of the coolest engraving design details I've seen on literally any pen. While I'm still zoomed in, let's look at this top cap. When the refill is retracted, the plunger pops out the top. And what's interesting is that this is actually made out of hardened 420 stainless steel. Did that for functional purposes in terms of what is actually rubbing on stuff on the inside, but it does have just a slight different color and texture than the titanium down below. It's another fun kind of contrast. And there's these really cool little divots that they put in there, which is purely for aesthetic. It's not like grip. You don't ever twist this piece. And when you push it in, it lines up almost perfectly with this top. and it gives you this really beautiful flush look. I find that it is slightly more flush over here, but in general, it's not trying to be perfectly flush. It's trying to evoke flushness. And I think it's just, I love it. I love the way it disappears. It's so cool looking. Overall, the aesthetics of this pen is just absolutely stunning. Even in this plain Jane version, which I absolutely adore, it is just so striking. And then this version over here with this engraving, like I said, this is just one of the coolest looking pens I've ever seen. Now, there's one thing I do want to point out that I wish was different, and that's this. I talked about this earlier when I showed the numbering. They put the name of the pen, Epika, and the serial number right below it. If you got one of the very first 25 or so, it even said like limited number, like 3 of 25 right there, which put even more billboarding. And it's subtle. I mean, it's not like it super stands out, but I just wish it wasn't there. This is the kind of thing, serial numbers, and if they're going to put the name of the pen on the pen, this is the kind of thing that works perfectly under a clip. I really wish they'd moved it down there, especially if you're going to make a pen that is so aesthetically beautiful and so purposeful in its look. I'm the type of person that thinks that it should have no branding on it whatsoever. A little Herman logo like that, that's classy enough. It's well positioned, it's well sized. I don't mind that. I actually kind of like it there. I'd be even more happy if the H was at the top of this cap, but this should definitely be hidden underneath the clip. But I do want to say one thing about this positioning here. It is perfectly spot on clocked with where the clip is. So while I wish it wasn't here at all, if you put your nail, for example, right in the center of where that is and look at how that lines up with the clip, it is dead center, perfect opposite this. And that is actually pretty difficult to do. I'm assuming they lasered this at the very end after this was already positioned, but even then, getting this set up in a way that they can repeatably, accurately put this exactly 180 degrees off, that's hard to do, and I appreciate that level of detail. Okay, let's finally talk about how this mechanism works, because this is wild. It is unlike any other mechanism I have ever seen, which is really rare to say these days. And honestly, it works in a way that kind of immediately defied my expectations. I don't mean it's counterintuitive. It's really, really simple and easy to use. It just kind of moves opposite of every other pen I've ever played with. When you push this in, the clip swings. That in of itself is so weird. I've never seen another pen do that. And then it's spring-loaded in this position. You have to push against spring tension and slide this around to make that pop back out. It's just a very peculiar, interesting motion that I wasn't expecting. Like the clip is under spring tension in the retracted position. Under normal circumstances, it's sprung, and extending the refill is actually what releases spring tension on the clip. That's the exact opposite of how other things work. Not that other things have spring tensioned clips normally, but in general, typically extending the pen is what puts it under spring tension, and retracting it relieves that. This is doing the opposite, or at least on that spring. That's another part. There's 2 different springs here. The vast majority of pen mechanisms rely just on the spring at the front of the refill to act as the entire spring tension for the system. There's some kind of rotary cam system inside, some series of ramps that make it so that if something does rotate or turn or move, it's all using that same spring. But this doesn't work that way. There's one spring acting on this piston, and then there's a second torsion spring acting on this clip. And so from a functional perspective, that solves one of my biggest concerns about this. If you've ever used something like a smooth precision pen, or any of the other modern ones that now are competing where the clip acts as the bolt, it's really, really cool having the clip do everything and make it so you don't have a different bolt sticking out of the way and getting in the way of your hand. I love that about it. But the problem with this specific implementation, the way Kelvin did these, is that it requires very little pressure to push this back over. That's all a factor of how this little hook works right here. This just isn't ramped down enough to prevent this from pushing back over. This is acting as like a detent basically. And especially with the light pressure springs that he ships with these, I find that in writing, it's quite common for me to accidentally twist this in my hand and have that pop back up. I grew up using mechanical pencils where you're constantly having to rotate it to get a sharp point on that tip. And so my natural writing stance is to slightly rotate pens in my hand as I go. And so it's extremely common for me to accidentally rotate this just enough, and it takes so little pressure that this would pop back up. It happens almost every single time I use this pen, and I'm having to actively train myself to not rotate the pen when writing in order to use this, because it drives me a little bit crazy. And I was worried that this might do the exact same thing. Now it rotates the other direction, so it wouldn't be this way of twisting in my hand. I'd have to be turning it this way in my hand for it to happen. But because this has its own actually quite strong torsion spring in here, this requires a significant amount of force to push this up and pop that back out. It's not hard to do with your thumb if you're trying to do it intentionally, but it's nearly impossible to do by accident with just your hand. In fact, if I sit here and try to twist this and try to force it with my hand, I literally cannot do it. I'm having to push so hard and it's digging into my hand in a way that's completely unnatural. I genuinely think this would never, ever accidentally close on you. Now, I mentioned that the shape of this is really, really cool looking when you're looking down the barrel. But do you notice how this is kind of crisp right here? It really thins out as it goes to the side. And so when I first started playing with this, I was trying to push on this side itself. I kind of hook my finger underneath it. And that's putting all of that force, which again is a reasonable spring tension, right along this crisp edge. And so when I first started playing with this pen, I thought it was a little bit uncomfortable to use. But I noticed that pretty quickly. I started adapting to putting my thumb kind of on this top portion right here. And now with that, it's effortless, painless, and I have no issue with it whatsoever. So having played with it for a while, I actually find that this is something I can fidget with for a while and it doesn't wear me out. But I thought it was going to, and it was doing that when I first started playing with it. So if you get one of these, make sure you're not pushing against that sharp edge and instead pushing along this top portion. This is an easy enough fix in terms of training yourself to do it that it happened naturally for me within a couple of minutes of playing with it. But it is the kind of thing where I kind of feel like maybe they should widen this just a little bit going forward. I do think it would impact the aesthetic. It wouldn't be as dramatic looking, but I think you could still have a similar shape here with this being just slightly thicker along the edge, just to make sure that it's comfortable for absolutely everyone. There's another aspect I was worried about, the fact that the clip moves. If you look over here, this moves a full 60 degrees. Like if you just look down this and see how far this rotates, it is 60 degrees. And what that means is that sometimes I find that when I'm trying to close this, I'm accidentally holding it like this, where my hand is in the path of travel. And so it ends up kind of pinching against my hand. I'm accidentally blocking it. And so I was nervous that that might happen over here too. And theoretically, it could. When you push this, this tries to spring over. And so if you have it right up against your finger, yeah, you can accidentally block it. But importantly, this moves significantly less. I'm going to put my thumb right there so you can see where it started. See, that's barely moving over. This is only 30 degrees when I measured it. It's literally half as much travel as over here. And so the amount of zone that you have to be out of the way is really, really small. So I have actually found in practice that I never end up having this accidentally hit against my hand. It's really, really easy to use this without accidentally blocking it. Now, the fact that the clip does swing means that it has to float above the body of the pen. If it didn't, it would grind back and forth and cause an ugly little line there. And so the nature of that means that there is a slight gap. Let me bounce some light up underneath here so you can really clearly see that. Sometimes I find that floating clips like this don't give great spring tension, but if you look, this is only barely floating above the top. So I've had no issues with retention on this, even in like really thin shirt pockets, and it's still got enough spring tension to it that it easily fits over even thicker pants. So in practice, this has actually turned out to be an extremely functional clip. And if you look at how far this is coming up, it's pretty deep carry. It's not the deepest ever, but this is not bad, especially for a really fun, fancy milled tie clip. Now, theoretically, they could probably come up with some way of shifting this entire mechanism part forward, maybe, and making it so the part that spins is the very top, but I don't know if that would be very easy to use. I find in practice, I push this down and kind of brace against this as I push over. And if I try to just do it without my thumb on it at all, you can, but I definitely find it more comfortable having this surface at the top that doesn't rotate to brace against. Maybe they could shrink the size of it and still get away with that and make it even deeper carry, maybe. But as is, I really like the kind of shape and balance here. And since I said I do think that this feels more like a desk pen than something you're taking out on the go, it being not super duper deep carry isn't that big of a concern for me. And when I did shove this in my pocket, I didn't actually have any issues. Now, unfortunately, we can't disassemble this and show you exactly how this works for a couple of different different reasons. For one, this outer part of the top threads off. I think it might have thread locker on there. It doesn't want to back off, and I don't want to put any kind of pressure on this with pliers or anything like that. I would damage this. And so with normal tension alone, just my fingers, it doesn't unthread. But inside there are pieces that are press fit in, and so those are the kind of things you wouldn't be able to fully disassemble anyway. And the other reason is that there are loose ball bearings inside this. In fact, they give some really wonderful spec information on their website, much more than normal people give. So for clarity, there are 5 1mm, those are the super tiny ones, ceramic ball bearings, the silicon nitride, the black kind, acting as the bearings for the rotational movement of the clip. Then there's 3 2.5mm, really large silicon nitride bearings that he says are for locking. I'm not entirely sure what that means. And then there's 1 2mm zirconium dioxide, that's the white kind of ceramic. I don't know why they're using both different kinds. That's used for limiting the rotational motion of the clip portion, basically making it so it can't overextend in either direction. So there's a bunch of little ball bearings in here. And like I said, they're all free flowing. So if you did manage to disassemble this, you'd have to worry about making sure those don't fall out and you don't lose them. But how does this work? I'm going to try to explain how I think this is working, and I'll overlay some video taken from Herman's channel that shows what these components look like inside. Basically, there's 3 main components. We've got the stainless steel piston that can slide up and down, and there's a slot in it that limits how far it can move. We have a bronze portion in here that you can start to see if you unthread this, and that is where all of the ball bearings are embedded. And then finally, we have this titanium ring around the outside that is one integral piece with the clip. The torsion spring is applying rotational pressure against this outer collar and making it want to turn counterclockwise. There is a slot machined into the inside of this ring, and that ball bearing that's embedded in that bronze portion allows the slot to slide back and forth around that ball bearing. The length of the slot limits how far it can rotate, and importantly, that slot itself is being blockaded by this piston when it's in the retracted position. But once you slide this down, you're moving it out of the way of that path, and now the spring tension can take over and slide this back. Once this is slid over, it's now blockading the piston. The spring down here is wanting to push that piston back, but it's now being blockaded by the ring. And so rotating the ring back against the spring pressure pulls it back out of the way and allows the piston to slide back up. So in this position, the piston is blocking the ring, and in this position, the ring is blocking the piston. It's honestly really kind of simple in a way, but it's so different from how everything else works that it is also incredibly clever. And sometimes I find that push button mechanisms that have an alternative release aren't the most fidgety just because of how much you have to move. I find that I actually fidget with this one using both of these fingers. Rather than pushing and sliding like this, you can do this, I end up doing this instead. And this is so fun and easy to do. I absolutely love fidgeting with this. And so this is a mechanism that I've actually come to really, really enjoy playing with too. So my final thoughts on this pen is that I absolutely love it. It is stunningly beautiful. It is such an incredibly cool and clever, weird, neat mechanism, and I've really enjoyed playing with it. Like I said, I enjoyed this so much that I immediately went out and got my own. And I'm very, very happy to have it in the collection. Like I said a couple of times, I definitely think this leans more towards a desk pen than a travel pen. That's partly because of its luxury aesthetic and partly because of how just kind of heavier and thicker it is, but it's still lightweight and compact enough that it does carry pretty well. Now, price-wise, these are not cheap. The simplest versions like this come in at $229, and that's true of the anodized versions as well. But again, remember, the cheapest shipping option from Polish Custom Knives is $40, so you kind of have to work that into the price of the pen in your mind. The price goes up from there if you get one of the fancier versions that's got like hand dimple patterns up here or some of the weirder stuff that they've done in the grip section, and all the way up to this version here with this gorgeous, incredible looking engraving. This is $80 more at $309. Yeah, this pen costs over $300. And again, if you work that shipping cost in, this is effectively a $350 pen. And that's going to push it out of the vast majority of people's price points. And there's not a whole lot out there in the pen market that's trying to be over $300. The first one that comes to mind is, of course, the Grimsmo Saga, which is by far one of my absolute favorite pens of all time. So do I think it's competing at that price point? Honestly, yeah, the attention to detail here, the quality of this machining, the cleverness of the mechanism, it really does stand in the same kind of company as this. And if you're not getting all of this fancy milling, now we're talking about something that is almost $100 cheaper than the Saga. The Saga definitely leans more utilitarian, and so the fact that this feels even more like a luxury pen might be a pro, or maybe this is too fancy looking for you. Maybe you like things that are really kind of utilitarian looking in a way. I know it's not going to be for absolutely everyone, even if they could afford it, but boy do I think this is going to be a compelling option to a lot of people. Whether you're a mechanism nerd like me and want to nerd out about how clever and weird this is, or you just want an extremely elegant pen, I think you're going to want to check one of these out. So again, huge thanks to Isaac for sending this my way. Huge thanks to Dan for helping me get this one. And thank you to all of you for watching. I'll catch you all next time.